And so as we look at energy, there's both energy supply issues and there's energy demand, right? So it's a supply and demand situation. Our building efficiencies business, in which I work, has designed and developed capabilities over our 130-year existence to help with that energy demand side. And so the fact that buildings across the U.S. right now are using a majority of the energy produced for this country gives a great opportunity to how do we fix this? And it's not just the new buildings that are populating the landscape, it's the buildings that have existed there for 1 year to 100 years. And how do you work with those buildings to drop down the amount of energy that they're using? And there's one study that said you should be able to reduce that energy usage by 30% across all those buildings. So it's potentially $1 trillion opportunity that we have the ability to go and have impact on.
That's great. I mean, and then does that sort of dovetail into why Johnson Controls is a board member on the Alliance to Save Energy?
Yeah, absolutely. We think solving energy is going to be solved by the right stakeholders getting together. It's just not developing more supply. That's actually the last thing we want because of all the costs inherent in developing that supply, being greenhouse gas, carbon emissions. And so what we can do is work with the planet, with all the businesses, with all the buildings on the planet, to how do we reduce that demand so instead of needing 100% of that energy, you need 70% of that energy. And how you start driving the energy usage more to the individuals and what their needs are within the buildings. And so we've been involved with the Alliance to Save Energy for a number of years now. And also as we look at the partners with whom we need to work, and maybe in the past it was purely on the building side. You didn't need to look further than that. Now as we look forward to really succeed, we're going to have to be working with utilities, with the buildings, with other partners in solving this difficult and huge problem. In 2030, and once again it's interesting, the way I look at this is in my mind I don't picture just the US or a state, I picture this planet. And I think to really survive and do well by 2030, this planet and all the appropriate governments, most specifically the United States and China, needs to come to some realization and agreements that we must work on reducing the energy supply, or at least the cost of the energy supply that we have in place today. And how do we get smarter about this? And so I think it is individuals and buildings taking more responsibility of the energy they use in a realization of the cost of that energy. You have pockets and examples of people or groups or cities who are piloting and trialing these, but they're very, very rare and it's not mainstream. And so I see 30 years out, people think of the cost of energy as much as, and Mark Bartow talked about it earlier today, the cost of gas. People can readily talk about, here's how much gas costs today, here's how much it cost last week. Much less ability to know, and what are those costs of energies that by my actions I take, how is that impacting the costs that we pay? And it's interesting with buildings how that's even changing is years ago, LEED certification was developed and that became the standard that everyone's sort of chasing today. And there are studies that say tenants are willing to pay more for a LEED certified space. So that's a great step in the right direction, that it is now starting to have impact on the consumers or the customers in terms of what they're purchasing. What we've also realized though is LEED certification gets you to the starting point. The building is now ready to be inhabited, go forward, and that building will be inhabited for up to 100 years. And so how do you ensure that you're measuring real time what's happening versus what it was like at the starting line? This is a long race that's going to be run, and there's new metrics that are being looked at to really measure the usage of the building over time, because these buildings are living, breathing items that change from day one to year 100. And how do we work with them and ensure that they're driving the right energy savings and the right sustainability?
How do you?
Well, it's and it was brought up today by a couple of individuals, it is measuring. It's measuring what it is you're doing today, and it's measuring not to a building level, ultimately it's measuring down to a room by room level, so that you're truly able to understand, what are the costs to heat and cool and light this room and how do you work with that. There's emerging technologies that allow you to, as opposed to using drapes on your windows, that you can shade the windows and you could affect that by the sunlight coming in. And so you could set yourself up that on weekends, for example, when no one is in the building, if it's a summer day, you'd have the windows open, but you'd have some type of a sensor in place that as the heat from the light from the sun gets too strong, those windows immediately start shading. And by doing that, you're putting less load on your HVAC systems, and so you're saving up to 20 to 30% of the HVAC conditions. So it's really starting to look at a building not as a bunch of disparate pieces, but it's an entire living system that you need to optimize that living system versus one component of it. Maybe just a couple of comments on some of the projects we've recently announced. And one is with the state of Hawaii that we just contracted with in December over a 19-year period to save $500 million in energy. And it works there because the energy costs in Hawaii are 3 times the national average because you're shipping all of the oil over to the islands. And so they were a very great test case to do this. But I think what it does show is that the governmental entities, when they put their minds to it, are able to all go forward on the same page and say, we can fix this and do better. I think the other is the example I gave earlier today about the University of Akron and the deal that we announced today, where we're going to be saving them a minimum of $60 million over the next 15 years. So $4 million a year, $4 million in cash that they have to reinvest where they see necessary. And really it's done by these buildings that are on their campus are inefficient. And there's ways to make them more efficient. And my belief and challenge to the state of Michigan and this university, my alma mater, is what is our story for that? What can we be doing here at the University of Michigan to drive $100+ million of savings, which could then be reinvested into the university? 4 years ago, we partnered with Tony Melkin, the owner of the Empire State Building, and us and a number of other parties got together because everyone's always interested in the new building, right? The new shiny thing that's going up and how do you make it efficient? Well, here's an 80-plus-year-old building. How could you work with this? And by going into that building, measuring and understanding what exists today, and how do you upgrade what exists today, from the chillers in the basement to the air handling units to the windows to how people are relating to the building, we're able to drive 30+% energy savings throughout the building. And so our core, the history of Johnson Controls, comes from building controls. And so we have a system that's able to measure signals that are happening within this building down to the very finite level. And by pulling together, and we've talked about it today in the session, the right sensors and measuring these disparate objects, you can start putting together a picture, not of a chiller in the basement, but what impact is that chiller having on this overall building. And so with the controls capabilities that Johnson Controls has, with the HVAC product, the chillers, the air handling units capabilities that we have, we can marry these together and have sensors on this equipment to truly understand when are these components running optimally, and how do you need to make the changes. And it depends on, is it 8 a.m. in the morning and everyone's coming in the door? Is it 5 p.m. and they're leaving? Is it the middle of the night? How do you start preparing this building on a hot summer day to be ready when the students come in? Do you start the chillers at 6 a.m., 5:30 a.m., 7 a.m.? And there's data that you can use to optimize that formula to ensure that you are optimizing both the costs to deliver and that period that the students or the individuals in the building have an experience. We at Johnson Controls think this is an incredible opportunity, and it's interesting the way we look at the size of this market. In one way is that we sort of do a bottoms up, sort of what's all the market research reports, is about a $100 billion global opportunity. A year ago, Cisco in their Internet of Things event talked about the smart buildings opportunity once everything gets connected, and they've identified a $350 billion opportunity. Deutsche Bank did a study about a year ago that said the opportunity in all these buildings that exist on this planet to pull out 30% of that cost is $1 trillion a year opportunity. And so, following on the comments about doubling productivity by 2030, there's a lot of opportunity in front of us for us to go after.